Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about why I usually recommend that people perform the deadlift later in a workout. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skill at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. And I want to state, guys, this is just kind of my opinion. I have reasons for this. This doesn't mean it's the only way to do it. It doesn't mean that people can't build muscle, strength, and become a very successful deadlifter or even a world champion at the deadlift by doing this differently. But unless you are doing dedicated deadlift workouts, which is the difference here, meaning you have a day dedicated to the deadlift, where you're coming in and doing tons of deadlifting in one day, I don't usually recommend that people do the deadlift early in their workout. And this goes for purposes of powerlifting, general strength training, and even your overall gains. I think it needs to be later in the workout unless you are doing specialized deadlift specific workouts. And this comes up a lot. I've had this come up in the Q&As. I had someone say, hey, I'm thinking of doing the deadlifting before my squats and other stuff because it seems like after I do these other exercises, all this other stuff, I just can't deadlift as much weight, and so therefore I feel like I'm not getting as much out of the exercise. And I'm going to disagree with that, because what we need to be thinking of in terms of our overall training, unless you are trying to train a specific movement, right? Unless you have a specific movement that you really need to focus on maximizing strength on, which would be in this case a dedicated deadlift workout. You are trying to deadlift as heavy as possible in that workout with as much volume as you can handle of it to increase your 1 rep max maximally. And that's a little bit different than someone who's doing a general workout where you're trying to gain strength, muscle mass, things like that in one training session. And when we're talking about that, I don't think the deadlift needs to be early in the workout. And if anything, I think it can be counterproductive sometimes. And what that comes down to is because, yes, other exercises will fatigue your deadlift and you will not be able to lift as much weight, but that doesn't matter in the grand context of gaining strength and size. But what will happen is that one exercise, the deadlift, once you perform it, all your other exercises go down. In other words, if you do any moderately heavy deadlifting, all your lifts go down. You try to squat afterwards, your squat goes down. If you try to do rows or pull-ups or anything else, those all go down tremendously. It can even affect your bench press, even muscles that you're thinking of as not involved as primary movers in this exercise. And it has to do with the amount of just nervous system fatigue that this particular lift creates. And so what I would say with some of that, let's look at powerlifters, for example. That's one of the things you're going to note. With some exceptions, there are exceptions, but most powerlifters, this is a big mistake I see a lot of guys make early on. And I remember years ago, I think Brandon Campbell, early on YouTube Fitness, at least 5 years ago, I think went and did a powerlifting meet, and he was surprised. He gets to this meet, and he can't pull as much weight at the comp as he did in training, right? He couldn't hit it. He was something like 30 or 40 pounds less than what he had done as a gym lift. And, people try to figure out why. They'll look at this and say, well, I don't get it. I mean, I lifted, 580 pounds in the gym, and then I get to a meet and I go like 530, then I try to jump to 560 and I miss it, right? They miss it. Then you would ask, well, why? What happened? Because they trained the deadlift fresh, right? They trained the deadlift fresh. And when you train the deadlift fresh, you're going to be able to lift a lot more weight. But if you're pushing it to its limits, you need to think of the fatigue that creates for the rest of the week. You have to really program around that. If you're going to do legitimate, heavy deadlift-specific sessions, that will affect your recovery on everything. But back to the point, well, what happens in a powerlifting meet? You have to squat first. You have to build up to a max squat, possibly even miss a max squat. All right, that's going to fatigue you. And even if you get it, you come in and you hit an all-time squat PR, which is usually what happens for a lot of guys in one of their first couple of meets. They'll come in and they'll tend to oftentimes hit the best squat they've ever hit in their life. Bench will be pretty good, and then they'll get to the deadlift, and a lot of times they will miss lifts that they hit in the gym. Well, again, they put all their energy into that squat. They were fresh when they did the squat. They were hyped up there at the excitement of a competition, and they did that. Well, that fatigues your entire posterior chain, your quads, your back, your core, everything. Everything gets fatigued. Well, even though they might have quite a few hours apart, then they do the bench press. So what happens if you start arching on the bench press? Well, that starts fatiguing your lower back, doesn't it? All that arching, if you use an arch, fatigues the lower back. So by the time you get to the deadlift, your nervous system is tired, you're fatigued from all the other lifts, the excitement of trying to prolong that excitement and being hyped up for that entire meet. Your lower back is usually really fatigued between the squat and then arching on a bench press, and you get to the deadlift and you don't have a whole hell of a lot left oftentimes. And so that fatigue is accumulated and then you struggle with it. Whereas if you train the deadlift later in a session, at least the third heavy lift you do in any workout, guess what? You're used to pulling fatigued. You're going to have a much more realistic idea of what you can deadlift when you're more fatigued. So there's that to consider for the competitive power lifter. I would definitely recommend doing some training where you deadlift later in a session instead of just dedicated sessions if you want to get a realistic feel or learn to deadlift when you're tired. And the same thing comes around when we start talking about training. The deadlift tends to work most of the muscles in the body. It's an overall fantastic, just general strength builder. But it's the same thing even if we're doing it for hypertrophy. Let's say you're doing deficit deadlifts or snatch grip deadlifts or one of these harder variations for the purposes of hypertrophy. It still tends to work a lot of the muscles in the body. And what you need to remember is that just because some of the muscles are fatigued on a lift and forces you to lift less weight, does that mean you still don't get a training response? No, of course you still get a training response. All the other muscles are still involved. They're still firing maximally. You just might be limited on what you can lift based upon the other stuff. And here's the thing. If you are doing a full session, let's say a big training session, you're trying to just create a general fatigue. You're trying to stimulate muscle growth. You're trying to stimulate strength. You're trying to cause all these adaptations. The deadlift being thrown in there, you're just there to accumulate more fatigue and to train a movement pattern, get bigger, get stronger. You don't have to lift maximum weight. In other words, the weights you're lifting could actually be not even within 2 reps of failure. You might be doing 3 rep sets with a weight that you could actually do 5 or 6 reps with. You're just accumulating some extra fatigue on the deadlift. It's just a good general exercise and you're training the movement pattern. A lot of your actual really limit sets are probably on your other exercises. So again, that's where I think for larger workouts, that's where the deadlift tends to fit in better. It fits in better as you get further in. It fits in better as you get further in. And that will still be fine even if someone wants to go compete in powerlifting because you're used to deadlifting fatigued, which is what you're going to do at a meet. But what ends up happening is that if you want to talk about overall training response and the workloads that you can do in a single training session, and I don't care whether it's full body or you're doing some sort of pull specific workout, these other exercises are going to add a lot to what you're trying to do. The deadlift itself is not always the best hypertrophy exercise. I think there's a fair case to be made for that. It's a great exercise, probably my favorite exercise, but it has limited scope as a accumulation tool of metabolic fatigue and things in the body because of just the recovery versus what you can stimulate with it. So these other exercises are going to give you more mileage. I don't care whether it's back training or leg training or anything else. The squat's going to give you more mileage. Your pull-ups and rows and stuff are going to give you more mileage. And so if you're doing those things before you get to the deadlift, you're going to end up being able to do more total work in the training session. Because if you deadlift first with any degree of intensity, you're going to dramatically reduce what you can do on those other exercises. Whereas if you do them fresh, you're accumulating a lot of fatigue. And if you were going to do sub-maximal deadlifts anyways, you're probably not going to see a big difference. It'll be a small difference, but it's not going to matter if you weren't going to do limit sets anyways. So you end up getting more total stimulation in one workout if you put it further in, like the third or the fourth, or in some cases the fifth exercise. I usually do it as like my fifth exercise right now. So that's something to think about with it in terms of just total accumulated fatigue with what you're trying to do. It works better further in because otherwise it just destroys your entire training session. You come in and deadlift as your first or second exercise, and then you try to do any other sort of intense training, it's going to just completely eliminate your ability to train with any degree of intensity or workload or anything else because it's just so fatiguing. But what are we trying to do near the end of a training session, right? If we're trying to stimulate total maximum fatigue, it works very, very well as a finishing exercise. And even if you're forced to use, reduced weights. reduce volume and everything else on the deadlift later, you're still training the motor pattern for the big lift. You're still training the motor pattern, and that motor pattern training that you're getting is still going to carry over to a 1 rep max, to your technique, everything else. So generally I tend to push people in that direction, and I'm not saying dedicated deadlift workouts don't have their place, because they do, but those have to be used sparingly. They have to be used sparingly. And I think if you want to train the deadlift in the context of a larger training session in which you're focused on more than the deadlift, it really and truly does work better, in just my opinion, if it's done later in a training session after you've already pushed yourself relatively hard on several other big exercises. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.